you. So as Padma said, this is a talk about what it means for a plant to be a monster. In fact, whether a plant can really be a monster. And so in the talk, first I'm going to look at how this has been dealt with historically in scientific plant teratology, that is the study of plant monsters, and then look at how some of the particularities, or how the particularity of plant teratology is related to some of the characteristic features of normal plant life. Then we'll look at the representation of plant monsters in the genre of plant horror. And in this talk, I hope to show that plant horror actually really has great trouble in imagining plants as monsters for reasons explained in the plant teratology literature, returning us to the question at the end of whether a plant as a plant can really be a monster. So teratology, as I said, is the study of monsters. The word monster derives from the classical, or the word teratology derives from the classical Greek teras, meaning a sign or a wonder or a portent. And a significant part of the early history of teratology was devoted to descriptions of monstrous births, for example, and they were treated as portents or divine signs, along with other natural wonders like earthquakes and floods and volcanoes and rains of blood, apparently, of which there were many. By the 17th century, however, the study of human and animal monsters was beginning to be distanced from these other natural phenomena like volcanoes, and beginning to be incorporated into zoological discourses of comparative anatomy and embryology, bearing witness to what historians have described as a gradual naturalization in the explanation of monsters. By the 19th century, study of monsters was really firmly embedded in the life sciences, with many arguing that the study of abnormal forms was an important aid to the understanding of normal development and growth. The second volume of Etienne Saint-Hilaire's Philosophical Anatomy, published in 2022, is an example. It's devoted to human monstrosities, as we can see there. His son, Isidore, continued the scientific work, published his own general and particular history of anomalies of organization in man and animals between 1832 and 1837. And because he subtitled his book Treatise on Teratology, as you can see there, he is credited with reintroducing the word teratology into a properly scientific context. The following decades then saw the publication of a number of works on vegetable teratology. This talk was inspired by the best known of these works in English, which is by Maxwell T. Masters. His book is called Vegetable Teratology. This is his notebook on teratology, which is a kind of record of the research that he did for the book. These are some of the pages inside the notebook, which is held in the archive at Kew. And this is the published work, Vegetable Teratology, an account of the principal deviations from the usual construction of plants. Now, I just said that the tendency in the general history of teratology is the shift from treating monsters as signs and wonders to treating them as naturally explicable phenomena, and valuable for the study of normal forms. But this general history of teratology overlooks to some extent the specificity of scientific vegetable teratology. So modern medical teratology concerns pathological and often life-limiting or life-threatening congenital and environmentally acquired abnormalities. It aims to understand the genetic bases and various causes of these abnormalities, especially in human beings, in the hope of being able to one day eradicate them. But vegetable teratology, on the other hand, as Padma said in the introduction, has actually always struggled to distinguish between the meaning of normality and abnormality for plant life. And many scholars of vegetable teratology, masters included, effectively denied that the idea of abnormality had anything other than a merely statistical meaning in relation to the morphological differences you can see within plant species, no matter how extreme or how rare those morphological differences are. In an important sense, then, Masters and others like him were developing the idea that there actually are no monsters in the plant kingdom. But if this is the case, then what sense can we make of the literary and filmic genres of plant horror, where the traditional monster of the classics of the horror genre is replaced by a vegetable threat? Is it, as some suggest, that plants are in themselves somehow perceived as a kind of threat to human beings? And if so, how? What, if anything, is horrific about plants in plant horror? Now, the difference between zoological and vegetable teratology reflects some of the differences between the basic characteristics of animal and plant life. And I'm going to concentrate on three of these in very general terms: morphological plasticity, cell pluripotency, and reiteration and vegetative reproduction. So first, plants exhibit far greater phenotypic plasticity in comparison with animals. That is, whereas the body plan of an animal is, and the relation between the shape and size of its various parts is predictable and visible from early on in its development, plant morphology, the actual shape that a plant assumes, is much more variable. So we could say, well, look, the ratio between the size of a dog's head and its paws is going to change a little bit as the dog matures. But once it's born, the basic shape will enlarge. We could also say a human newborn is, is kind of proportionally different to an adult human. But as it matures, its head remains basically oval, and the position of the arms and legs in relation to the body remains basically the same, as is required for the use of these limbs. In each case, the animal body plan is related to the specific functions of each part. A plant, in comparison, is really extremely morphologically plastic. The positions of the branches on a tree, for example, are highly variable. One could find that two trees grown from the same seed batch might mature into notably different forms, depending on environment and, all aspects of the environment: climate, soil, position, proximity to other trees, and so on. An individual plant's overall morphology might also change considerably during its lifetime. So a once vertical tree that is forced into a horizontal position by years of being climbed on or by being blown over may well begin to sprout new vertical roots from the trunk, so long as some root system remains, as demonstrated here by my dog. So what was once a lateral branch has become like a second vertical trunk here. A lateral branch has become like a second vertical trunk. Now, examples of morphological plasticity feature very prominently in the 1920 book Water Plants by the English botanist Agnes Arber. Arber describes how the leaves of various water plants take different forms depending whether they grow in, for example, shallow ditches or fast-flowing water. She describes how dramatically the length of the leaves of water plants varies depending on the conditions in which they grow, and she describes how the same species develops significantly different forms depending on whether it finds itself in land or water, presuming it can live in both. This slide shows water buttercup leaves with the leaf form of a water plant on the top there, and the leaf form of a land plant of the same species underneath. So there are Arber's own drawings, and you can see the form of the leaf is really quite different in both cases. This is a photograph of the same phenomenon, but showing morphological diversity of leaves on the same plant, probably. Now, all these are examples of what we will for now call normal variations in plant growth. Any comparison or any comparable variation in animal growth, if that comparison even makes sense, and I'm not 100% sure it does, any such variation in animal growth would be considered abnormal. For example, a cat that had significantly different shape or size of limbs would be considered abnormal. Another way of putting this is the window of normal variability is much greater for a plant than it is for an animal. But there are also what we will for now call abnormal examples of plant growth, like these proliferous roses in Master's book, Vegetable Teratology. He calls them proliferous roses. He defines proliferation as the production of buds in unwanted situations, unwanted in the sense of unusual situations. And most of us would probably recognize that this growth of a shoot with leaves from the center of the flower is indeed unusual. Other abnormalities, however, are less obvious. For example, what Masters calls petalody of the stamens, that is, where one might expect to see stamens in the center of the flower, one sees instead additional petals. So you see here on the left a kind of normal begonia flower and petalody in the begonia flower. So the flower on the right is abnormal. This is the phenomenon also that gives rise to the double blooms prized by gardeners and florists. This is just a screenshot of from a horticultural supplier. And although these double blooms, meaning they have another set of petals instead of having the stamens and style, although these have historically been called monstrous flowers, they're obviously hardly ugly or misshapen to most of our eyes, unlike the traditional monster of horror genres. On the contrary, they're often considered to be the most beautiful and desirable blooms. So much so that they're sold out, as you can see in this slide. Some of the normal variations in plant morphology, like the growth of new vertical branches after a change in trunk orientation, or the ability of plants in some circumstances to grow roots from their stems, and some of the abnormal phenomena that I've just mentioned, like petalody. These are made possible by the second characteristic of plant life mentioned earlier, cell pluripotency. Plant meristems, the tips of the shoots, are populations of pluripotent or embryonic cells capable of becoming cells of any type. Hence, floral meristems that under normal circumstances would produce stamens as part of the flower might instead produce extra petals in their place, which happens in petalody. In animal development, cells differentiate early on, and once they are differentiated, once they become a cell of a certain type, for example, a liver cell, they can very rarely de-differentiate and become a cell of another type. But in plants, many cells retain the potential to de-differentiate, that is, return to an earlier stem cell-like state, and then re-differentiate, giving rise to new structures or organs. So this cell pluripotency and the phenomenon of the morphological plasticity of plants connects to the third characteristic feature of plant life relevant to the talk here, vegetative reproduction and reiteration. So as we know, a fragment broken off from one part of some plants can grow into a complete new plant with all its different parts, hence the difficulty in getting rid of some weeds. And many of us are familiar with the multi-trunked shapes of regrown coppice trees, as in this example. There's actually a lot going on here. I don't know if it's one or two trees. Plant growth typically occurs through vegetative reproduction of reiterated units of growth, like repeated stem, leaf, bud unit. Both as part of regular uninhibited development and in response to damage, for example, replacement of lost parts by if the plant is eaten by an animal or an insect, or if a part of a plant is lost because of human intervention or because of environmental damage. And as the botanist Francis Allais has pointed out, the equivalent process in a human would be something like proliferation of toes. So this is an image from Halley's book In Praise of Plants. Reiteration, which is just a perfectly is the form of growth in plants, would be something like more toes budding from the point of growth of existing toes from the feet, or even severed toes regrowing, or arms and legs regrowing. And his point is obviously that reiteration is the normal form of growth of plants, but would be highly abnormal in an animal. So what is abnormality in a plant? Taking these three characteristics together, morphological plasticity, cell pluripotency, and vegetative reproduction and reiteration, we can perhaps see why students of vegetable teratology struggled to distinguish between normal and abnormal forms in plants. So Masters actually begins his book, Vegetable Teratology, with the claim that it is impossible to frame any but a purely arbitrary definition of teratology, or to trace the limits between variation and malformation, the difference between variation and malformation being merely one of degree, and difficult to determine in part because, he says, of the inherent tendency to vary in many plants. He notes, for example, that the broccolis and cabbages of the kitchen garden, as he says, are from one point of view monstrous, because they are quite extreme cultivars of the same species. So from one point of view, they are monstrous, but at the same time, to us, they're perfectly normal. Masters also points out that the frequency with which certain teratological forms appear makes it difficult to call them abnormal or to think of them as malformations. One of the examples is Peloria. So in this image, the plant on the left is the normal, so-called normal form of the primrose. The plant on the right is the abnormal or peloric form. So that's where Peloria is where an irregular flower has instead become regular. Masters concludes, and just point out once again that although that is a monstrous form, it's hardly ugly or scary. Masters concludes that the so-called monstrous formations, excluding morbid growths, excluding the result of disease or injury, present no peculiarities absolutely foreign to the normal organization of plants. The difference between the natural and the monstrous is one of degree and frequency of occurrence, not of kind. And nearly a century later, Agnes Arber, the English botanist I mentioned earlier, similarly affirmed the value of the study of abnormal forms, understanding the abnormal forms as demonstrations of what the plant can do. The revelation of potentialities not usually actualized. So for Arber, again, in her book on water plants, she describes the fantastically long roots and the supernormal luxuriance, or the sometimes enormously long leaves of arrowheads, or the hugely elongated leaf stalks in water lilies, but doesn't describe them as monstrous, just displays of the plant's morphological possibilities allowed by opportunity and environment. Now, one important set of exceptional formations, as Masters calls them, seems to have more of a claim to be understood more of a claim to be understood as true abnormality. These are the variations that adversely affect any of the physiological functions of the plant. Historically, those abnormalities that affect the function of sexual reproduction in particular were precisely those that were called monsters. So monstrous flowers, including the beautiful cultivated double blooms, seem to have been called monstrous precisely because they are often sterile. And on this point, the histories of animal and vegetable teratologies do converge, specifically the histories of human and vegetable teratologies seem to converge, as the human hermaphrodite, also presumed to be sterile, was also often treated as monstrous or as an error of nature. But even here again, of course, forms of hermaphroditism in plants are nothing abnormal. Indeed, they're significantly more common than the separation of male and female individuals. Sex change in plants is also nothing particularly unusual and certainly not abnormal. When Masters comes to treat of apparently obvious abnormalities in the parts of plants involved in sexual reproduction, for example, as here, the formation of pollen, considered to be male, within the plant ovary, considered to be female, he still understands them as showing the wide limits of possible variation. I'm quoting him, shows the wide limits of possible variation, not abnormality, which thus may even involve the sex. And that for him is evidence that the sexual organs of the plants are morphologically homologous. And although he has a whole chapter in the book on what he calls heterogamy, which is where the arrangement of the sexual organs is different from what it is habitually, he says, he treats it as evident that, I quote, in many instances there is no malformation, no monstrosity, but rather a reversion of organs habitually suppressed, a tendency towards structural completeness rather than the reverse. So if it's often difficult to distinguish between normal and abnormal in a plant, if some so-called abnormal forms are so common as to be, in a sense, normal, if vegetal monstrosity is often actually cultivated for its beauty, or as foodstuff for us, what makes a plant a monster in plant horror? How do plants predominantly figure in literary and filmic plant horror? Now, interestingly, some of the recent work in the humanities on plant horror has tended to assume, in opposition to Masters, well, although I'm not sure that they're familiar necessarily with Masters' work, but tend to assume the opposite of Masters. That is, that the potentialities of the genre of plant horror lie in the fact that, from a human point of view, plants are somehow inherently monstrous, or that plant life is sort of inherently abnormal in comparison with animal and especially human life. So Dawn Keatley, for example, who identifies the basic ground of plant horror as humans' dread of the wildness of vegetal nature, its untamability, its pointless excess, she says, its uncontrollable growth, its implacable strangeness. And according to Keatley, plant life's refusal of known categories means that plant life itself lurks perilously close to the very definition of the monstrous. In general, though, the most striking feature of the most common fictional manifestations of vegetable threat is that the plant of plant horror, in order to be precisely monstrous, tends to act like or take on the characteristics of animal life, notably locomotion and motor control of limb-like appendages, arms and legs. In both literary and filmic forms, carnivorous plants, vines, creepers, and plants with tendrils appear most frequently. Plant horror refers to the natural tendencies and characteristics of these plants, for sure. For example, non-directional movement in response to a stimulus. So the shutting of the Venus flytrap, or directional growth movement responding to touch stimulus, like the coiling of a tendril around a stake. But in plant horror, these natural tendencies and characteristics of plants are transformed into recognizably animal forms, and in particular, movement becomes controlled predatory behavior with evil intent. Now, the fictional possibilities offered by the idea of outsized and malicious carnivorous plants are perhaps obvious. Their appearance in late 19th century fiction in particular it stems from and is really explicitly related to a fascination with what were for Europeans relatively newly discovered plants that seemed to somehow trouble the very distinction between plants and animals because they were carnivorous. So to give just one example, in a short story from 1889 by Lucy H. Hopper called Carnivorine, the protagonist is an increasingly sort of self-secluding and basically unhinged botanist called Julius Lambert, and he's been breeding carnivorous plants to ever greater proportions in order to, he says, perfect a demonstration of the link between the vegetable and the animal kingdom, or more particularly and more tellingly, to develop the animal side of these curious vegetable natures, and even to give the creature locomotion. And as you can probably guess, it doesn't end well for our hero. So the threat then comes from the plant taking on animal attributes. I mean, you know, grabbing and pulling him into its picture. The threat comes from the plant taking on animal attributes, particularly being able to move, grab, and hold struggling victims tightly. The many vines, creepers, and climbing plants that also appear in plant horror similarly tend to take on animal-like locomotive and grasping abilities and often feed like vampires on their victims. So it seems then that it's not the specifically vegetal characteristics of plants that generally supply the horror in traditional plant horror, such as it is, because I have to say, on the whole, it's not very horrific or scary. But it's so, but you know, however one feels about the horror quotient of plant horror, it's not the specifically vegetal characteristics of plant that generate the horror, but rather the plant becoming animal, the plant transfigured to adopt the behavioural characteristics of animals. And nowhere is this clearer than in the 1963 film adaptation of John Wyndham's 1951 book, The Day of the Triffids. Although the film is a rather loose adaptation of the book, Wyndham does supply the basic trope that gives rise to the monster of the film, which is walking plants. And you can see already here the illustration on the first edition of the book has made the plant exceptionally animal-like. The Triffids are probably the result of biological meddlings, according to the protagonist of the book. They're new, never seen before plants. They seed and they spread very easily after being accidentally released into the wild. They spring up all over the world, including in the suburban gardens of England. I think it's actually set in Surbiton in the beginning. And people are at first puzzled and very curious about the Triffids flowers, which are described as conical cups in the book, conical cups with tightly wrapped whorls within. And people also notice and wonder about the three small little bare sticks that grow straight up beside the stem. It's not until a bit later, however, when the first one, I quote Wyndham, the first one picked up its roots and walked, using its active three-pronged root, that's why they're called Triffids. It's not until they start walking that global interest in the new plant really takes off. And there's a section in Wyndham's book in which there you see he talks about reports from all over the world of the walking plants. Everyone thinks it's really hilarious. And there's one from Ecuador in particular that anticipates the tenor of the later film adaptations, because their headline is "Monster Plants on the March." Now, the mature plants in Wyndham's book are equipped with a lethal sting that is delivered from a sort of whip-like thing that comes out of the flower cup. They feed on the flesh of their victims. So I quote Wyndham: "The stinging tendril did not have the muscular power to tear from flesh, but it had strength enough to pull shreds from a decomposing body and lift them to the cup on its stem. In order to move, kill, and eat, then, the Triffids have body parts actually characteristic of animal rather than plant life." In Wyndham's book, the Triffids are first farmed because it turns out that one can farm from them an extraordinarily nutritious oil. And they are tethered to stakes with chains so that they can't move, and their whipping appendages are removed. But then it's discovered that the quality of the extracted oil improves if they retain their stings, so they stop removing them, just being very careful around them. And then suddenly disaster strikes. There's a cosmic event. There are green flashes in the sky, completely unrelated to the appearance of the Triffids. And everyone who witnesses those green flashes in the sky is struck blind. And that's just a disaster for the human population. The Triffids escape, and then they can really easily prey on the human population because most of the population is blind. In the first film adaptation of Wyndham's book, the transformation of the plant into a sort of animal monster is complete, as this original film poster makes clear. And this is also true of the most recent BBC adaptation from 2009. But there's actually a BBC adaptation from 1981, which is much better. In one of the culminating scenes of the 1963 film, the scientist Tom Goodwin and his wife Karen are isolated on a lighthouse. But even here, they're not safe from the Triffids. They're hiding from the Triffids. It's not clear how the Triffids got onto the little lighthouse island, but never mind. And the Triffids are smashing through boarded windows and doors. There's a narrow circular staircase in the lighthouse, and the Triffids are sort of walking quite easily up this narrow circular staircase, and then they try to grab Tom and Karen. Now let's see if we can show a quick film clip. So they're very scared. The Triffids are actually sort of smashing through these boarded up windows and doors. So they run up the stairs, and the Triffids basically walk up the stairs after them. And then the female screams and is terrified, and they try to grab her, and then Tom discovers that if you spray them with salt water, they die, which is not part of the original source text. Anyway, although Tom and Karen have discovered a distinctly vegetal feature of the Triffids, which is that they can regenerate, as my description has indicated, the behaviour of the monsters is borrowed from animal life, and particularly those features of animal bodies that allow them to walk, grab and hold. So on the evidence of this, it looks like it's as if a properly vegetal monster is actually all but impossible to imagine. It's impossible to imagine a vegetal monster without turning it into an animal. But what happens when the properly vegetal characteristics of plants do find their way into the horror genre? A striking example is found in the 1951 version of The Thing from Another World, adapted from John W. Campbell's 1934 story, Who Goes There? In the original story, a team of scientists at a research centre in the Antarctic dig up a frozen spacecraft and a creature out of the ice. In Campbell's original novel, the creature is not vegetal, but comprised of alien cells with the ability to digest and reproduce the cells of other life forms. And that aspect of the source text is more faithfully represented in the 1982 film version by John Carpenter called The Thing. The numbers have dropped off there. But the originality of the 1951 film, The Thing from Another World, on the other hand, is the introduction of the vegetal dimension, and actually it relocates from Antarctic to the Arctic. So the creature from the 1951 film is humanoid in form. Here he is. When the creature first attacks the humans, they shoot at it, but realize that the bullet injuries don't stop it. The sled dogs then attack the creature and they rip off one of its arms, and this arm is retrieved, allowing the research station's chief scientist, Dr. Carrington, to examine it under his microscope. Carrington finds no blood or animal tissue in the arm. He realizes that losing an arm will not cause the creature to die, as the others hoped it would. He realizes that the effect on the creature of bullets is, he says, merely holes drilled into vegetable matter. He finds seed pods under the soft tissue of the palm of the creature's hand, on the severed arm, and he plants them in soil secretly. He plants them in soil soaked with plasma from the station's blood bank. These grow rapidly into little pulsating seedlings, as we can see in this film still here. Dr. Carrington says that the thing reproduces itself, amazing speed. He calls the young seedlings human plants. They're actually sort of moving a little bit in the film. This helps explain why, in the second sighting of the creature, it had regrown the previously lost arm, and very quickly. As Dr. Carrington says, the neat and unconfused reproductive technique of vegetation. Now, given that the creature in the 1951 film is a vegetal form of life, that is, basically it's a plant, you could argue that its appearing in humanoid form repeats once again the tendency of plant horror that I've just mentioned, the transference of animal characteristics, the animal form and motility to the plant. But unlike the other examples, the threat in The Thing from Another World comes from the specifically vegetal characteristics of the creature. These characteristics, including the ability to withstand physical trauma, including bullet injury and fire, by regrowing plants, and vegetative self-reproduction, are of course regular attributes of plant life. There's nothing horrific or monstrous about that for a plant, but when these attributes are imagined as belonging to a humanoid creature, it becomes a threat, hard to kill as an individual, hard to eradicate as a species. The regenerative capacities natural for a plant become a kind of supernatural ability for the humanoid monster. Its capacity for vegetative self-reproduction also suggestive of body horror possibilities. So, to conclude, if the genres of plant horror seem to show that the plant figures in them only when it takes on animal characteristics, or when it lends its own characteristics to the animal or human form, what can we say about the horror potential of the plant as plant? Can a plant ever be a monster as a plant? Or are monsters by definition really animals or aliens? Can the plant ever be a horror monster as a plant? Or are plants only ever really monsters in the older sense of the word, that is, wonders? Thank you very much.